Welcome back to Major Intonio's presentation of The Great Pacific War by Hector C. Bywater. Chapter 18, August to October, 1932.
It has been shown that the Japanese war leaders could not afford to wait indefinitely for the next move of their adversary. Still less dare they risk anything in the nature of a severe reverse, such as the loss of Guam, or even of the minor but strategically important Pelew Islands, which their naval advisors believed to be the immediate objective of this American thrust into the Western Pacific. As it happens, the naval view was the correct one. The plan adopted by the U.S. Bureau of Operations was to advance step by step to a position from which an invasion of the Philippines could be launched, and Angkor in the Pelew Group was the position selected. It was believed in Washington that nothing short of intervention by the Japanese battle fleet was likely to frustrate the methodical fulfillment of this plan. Thanks to the base established at Truk and to the naval forces now working therefrom, it was possible to make the route to the Pelews fairly safe from attack by Japanese cruisers or submarines, and although Angkor might prove to be lightly fortified, this contingency had not been disregarded. Thus, the only uncertain factor was the Japanese battle fleet. The general opinion was that Japan would not risk this force save in the last extremity. Whether she would consider a threat to Angkor sufficient justification for throwing in her fleet was doubtful. It seemed more probable that she would reserve her battleships to strike a hammer blow in defense of some position of greater importance, such as Guam, and it was upon this assumption that the whole scheme of American strategy now rested. Information received at Washington from Far Eastern sources tended to verify Admiral Harper's premises. There was no doubt that the Japanese regarded Guam as one of the vital points which must be defended to the last, for moral no less than for strategical reasons. So much having been postulated, it remained to devise a method of compelling the Japanese fleet to fight under conditions favorable to the American cause, that is, in an area distant from its home bases, and at the moment selected by the American commander-in-chief. Difficult as the problem appeared to be, it was not deemed insoluble. How the solution was achieved will now be made clear. The voyage of the pseudo-battleships to Truk and their subsequent cruise towards Guam have already been chronicled. This latter movement took place during the week of August 10th to 17th. 10 days later, it was repeated on much the same plan as before, but with certain modifications. On this occasion, the fleet steamed 50 miles further, thus arriving at a position only 100 miles to the southeast of the island. Again, it was sighted and attacked by aircraft, this time with more disastrous results. While the action was at its hottest, and the Japanese machines were advancing bravely through a barrage of fire, a heavy explosion was seen to occur just alongside the California, quickly followed by a second upheaval. Other detonations were observed, but whether from bombs or torpedoes did not transpire. The great ship was soon in distress and plainly sinking, though on an even keel, and in a surprisingly short space of time she had gone to the bottom, apparently taking most of her crew with her, for only 50 or more survivors were picked up by the destroyers. Intoxicated with their wonderful success, the Japanese aviators pressed on to attack the other battleships, throwing them into such confusion that one dreadnought was seen to ram her next ahead, which had turned suddenly to port, and was thus struck a glancing but powerful blow almost amidships. The damaged ship was identified by several Japanese pilots as the Oklahoma or her sister, the Nevada, and reported as such on their return. It became clear that she too was doomed, for when last sighted she was heeling over at a dangerous angle, and several crowded boats were pulling away from her. Further observation was impossible, for by now the chaser planes from the Alaska were up, and in the ensuing combat they shot down all but 4 of the Japanese machines. These 4 had been deliberately spared, in order that news of their tremendous success should be promptly borne to Guam, and thence to Japanese headquarters. It was just as well that the Oklahoma's end did not come until these witnesses had left, else they might have been diverted by the sight of ponderous turrets and 65-ton guns floating gently away from the deck of the battleship as she foundered. To explain that the crushing disaster that seemed to have befallen the squadron was a cleverly contrived piece of stage management is perhaps superfluous. No Japanese bomb had fallen within effective radius of any ship, but at a certain moment explosive charges had been detonated alongside the spurious California, giving a realistic impression of bomb hits close to the waterline, where they would prove most destructive. Then the sea cocks had been opened in such a way as to ensure the ship's sinking on an even keel, since too clear a view of the underwater bow or stern section of the mock battleship would have betrayed the trick immediately. The ramming of the Oklahoma had also been arranged beforehand. All those who had taken part in this elaborate comedy could congratulate themselves on the faultless manner in which it had been performed. Whether the desired results had been produced remained to be seen, but it was confidently believed that they had. That faked battleships should deceive the eye of trained naval officers, as the Japanese naval air pilots were, may seem incredible until the contributory circumstances are weighed. In the first place, the attack had been delivered at a considerable height, from which position a warship is most difficult to identify. Secondly, the view below was obscured by the smoke screen which the fleet's destroyers had put up, and still further by gun smoke and bomb splashes. Thirdly, it is a psychological fact that even the clearest-headed men, when engaged in some hazardous feat of arms, are liable to see things as they wish to see them rather than as they are, a phenomenon which explains the contradictory versions of sea battles fought in earlier wars and the long list of apocryphal losses suffered by the enemy, which each side compiles from the reports of men present, who honestly believe they are speaking the truth. It is, therefore, in no way surprising that the Japanese airmen who got back to Guam should have reported, in all good faith, that two of the finest American battleships had been sunk, one by their bombs, the other in collision. At Tokyo, where the tidings caused frantic jubilation, their accuracy was never questioned. More than this, the apparent ease with which two great dreadnoughts had been destroyed, one of them by bombs of less than maximum power, engendered a belief that the American type of battleship was more vulnerable to attack than had ever been suspected. Truly Oriental in their contempt for everything pertaining to Western civilization, even Japanese naval experts found no difficulty in persuading themselves that all American dreadnoughts were structurally defective. This theory had a momentous effect on their plans. Up to now, reckoning one American ship of given tonnage the equal in fighting power of a Japanese ship of the same type, they had felt no confidence in the outcome of an action in which their small fleet would be pitted against a much larger number of American battleships. But if the latter were weakened by some fundamental fault in design or construction, as Japanese experts now believed, numerical superiority would avail them little, and there was, in consequence, no reason to dread the result of an encounter with the American main body. Considerations of this nature, added to the pressing need for some dramatic success, led the Supreme Council to revoke their ban on active operations at sea. The Naval Command was instructed to make all preparations for a decisive engagement. Squadrons and individual vessels detached on special service were to be instantly recalled, with the view of effecting a concentration of all available ships. This accomplished, the fleet was to be held in readiness to put to sea in full strength at the shortest notice. Every unit, from battleship to submarine, was to sail with its maximum load of fuel. Other orders directed the assembly at Guam, where a large airbase had been established, of all efficient naval aircraft except those required for coast defense. Furthermore, such fleet auxiliaries, i.e. tankers, colliers, repair ships, ammunition ships, and tugs, as were momentarily stationed at other bases such as Ominato, Kure, and Sasebo, were ordered to proceed at once to Yokosuka. Finally, all Navy yards were instructed to lay aside everything but the most urgent work and hold themselves ready to deal with the long list of ship casualties that might be expected in the event of a great engagement taking place. These preparations naturally occupied time, but in less than 3 weeks they were completed. On September 17th, the entire fleet sailed for the Bonin Islands. Meanwhile, submarines had been dispatched from Guam to keep an eye on enemy activities at Truk. It was a duty attended with some peril, for the Americans were now very much on the qui-vive. Their listening posts gave immediate warning of any submarine that came within 10 miles of the islands, and both the air and destroyer patrols had been reinforced. One of the Japanese submarines, I-59, venturing too far in, was discovered and sunk by depth charges on September 14th, and other boats narrowly escaped the like fate. Beyond reporting the arrival at Truk of numerous warships and merchantmen, which appeared to be transports, the submarine scouts were unable to gather any information of value. It was accordingly resolved to try other methods. On September 20th, the airplane carrier Hosho, escorted by destroyers, steamed out of Port Lloyd and stood towards the southeast until within 150 miles of Truk, where a squadron of 4 scouts and 8 combat planes took off from her deck. Their orders were to avoid action if possible, but in any case to fly over Truk and make a careful survey of the shipping in port, and to use their cameras freely. Reaching the islands an hour after sunrise, they ran into a haze which made observation difficult, though it probably saved them from premature detection. They planed down to a low level and had made a complete circuit of the position and adjacent waters before being molested. But now a heavy fire was opened from the ships and batteries, and air patrols were speeding to attack them. 5 machines were lost before the pursuit could be shaken off. On returning to the Hosho, the survivors were able to report the presence in Truk of at least 8 large men-of-war, presumably battleships, 4 big cruisers, many destroyers, and a dozen vessels of mercantile build, intelligence that received visual confirmation when the photographs they had taken were developed. This news satisfied the Tokyo naval staff that a great expedition was about to be launched from Truk. But whereas they held the Pelew Islands to be its goal, the War Council persisted in regarding Guam as the American objective. While the debate was yet proceeding, messages came from the sea that appeared to vindicate the accuracy of the Council's judgment. A Japanese submarine patrolling to the north of Truk signaled that it had sighted a great fleet of vessels steering on a northwesterly course and had got sufficiently close to recognize 10 battleships and at least a dozen transports. When sighted, this armada was 70 miles to the north of Truk. Consequently, if making for Guam, as the course denoted, it had still nearly 550 miles to cover, a voyage that would take some 40 hours to complete, assuming the collective speed of the transports to be 14 knots. Though marveling at the rashness of the enemy in venturing upon such a desperate enterprise, the naval staff could no longer doubt that Guam was about to be attacked. Not a moment was lost in issuing the necessary orders. Less than 3 hours after the submarine's radio signal had been received, the Japanese battle fleet had left the Bonins with instructions to proceed at utmost speed to Guam. Everyone in the fleet was confident that we were steaming to fight the greatest sea battle in our history, writes Mr. Nakabashi, the naval historian who was present in one of the ships. There was no question of our failing to come upon the enemy and bring him to action soon after he had reached Guam. From the Bonins, our point of departure, to that island was some 860 miles, and we were steaming at 20 knots. We reckoned, therefore, upon reaching Guam 3 to 4 hours later than the enemy fleet, which, although it had a shorter distance to travel, was restricted to a speed 6 knots below our own by the presence of its slow transports. Enthusiasm ran high in the fleet. We had heard from the flagship that the enemy had only 10 battleships. Where were the rest? Perhaps they were coming up from some other quarter, for the Americans had already committed so many strategical blunders that no one would have been astonished to see them split up their battle fleet on the eve of action. All the better for us. We had 11 battleships, all faster than the enemy's. We had more cruisers and destroyers, and probably more aircraft as well. It would be strange if we could not fall upon the audacious invaders and utterly destroy them. From Admiral Hiraga, the commander-in-chief, to the youngest bluejacket, all were animated by a single resolve to win a resounding victory for Emperor and Fatherland. We cannot do better than follow the eloquent historian in his lucid account of ensuing events. All that day and throughout the night, he tells us, the Japanese fleet steamed on at high speed, keeping only 2 or 3 knots in reserve for the moment of action. On board the flagship, Nagato messages from submarine and air scouts, the latter operating from Guam, were coming in continually, in each case reporting the steady advance of the enemy towards Guam, though one of the later signals mentioned that the ships appeared to have slackened speed. At 4 p.m. on October 3rd, 35 hours after leaving Port Lloyd, we had covered approximately 700 knots and had thus approached to within 150 sea miles of Guam. The following day might deliver the foe into our hands. Then, like a cold douche, came a signal from the flagship. Scouts report enemy fleet altered course at 3:30 p.m. and now steering due east. Raise speed to 22 knots. Whatever this might presage, our battleships were now ordered to work up to within a knot of their maximum speed. Could the quarry be slipping through our fingers? The tension was extreme. Some mercurial officers who had been loudest in forecasting an early victory now went about with gloomy faces. Still, we continued to hope until at 5 p.m. the Admiral signaled, "Enemy has turned and is retreating south at full speed." At once we knew that our hopes of battle were dashed to the ground. True, we might, by a long stern chase with full pressure in our boilers, have overtaken the flying foe before he could regain his lair at Truk, but the risks of a dash into enemy waters, with our ships running short of fuel, would certainly not be countenanced by the higher command. At 5:30, the flagship made the expected signal: reduce speed to 12 knots. The chase was over, and we were now cruising slowly towards Guam, which was no longer in danger of attack. If we had failed to destroy the enemy, we had at least thwarted his design and saved a vital position from possible capture. It is to be feared, however, that even this crumb of comfort must be denied to the gallant narrator. Guam had never been in the least danger. The expedition whose approach had been so closely shadowed by Japanese scouts, and which had brought the Japanese battle fleet racing down from Port Lloyd, was nothing more than a collection of dummy battleships and empty transports, the latter being old merchant vessels more or less useless for any other service. The ruse had served a double purpose. It had tested and proved the Japanese readiness to fight a fleet action at this stage of the war. Secondly, it had diverted attention from any possible interference with the real expedition against the Pelew Islands, which had sailed from Truk a few hours in advance of the decoy armada. Transports conveying the troops for the Pelews had come direct from Hawaii, reaching Truk a week after the Japanese air reconnaissance of that port. 2 days later, the battle fleet also arrived, having called on the way at Jaluit, where the destroyers and cruisers had refueled. When the Pelew Expeditionary Force sailed on October 2nd, taking a southerly route to avoid submarines from Yap, the battle fleet covered it for 2/3 of the distance, 1,400 miles, though standing further towards the west. At the same time, a squadron of fast cruisers made a cast far to the north, from which direction the Japanese fleet must come, if it came at all. But all doubts on that head were set at rest on October 4th, when American submarines, which had previously been sent to scout to the north of Guam, reported having seen many Japanese battleships steaming south at full speed, obviously bent on intercepting the live bait squadron of dummy ships, which at that time were approaching Guam. It was thus perfectly clear that the Japanese main fleet was at least 800 miles distant from Pelew, and therefore in no position to molest the expedition, which was now only 2 days steaming from the objective. Nothing was to be feared save cruisers or submarines. As we saw, however, practically all such craft had been recalled from the South Seas nearly a month before to join the great concentration at Yokosuka. Angkor, the principal settlement in the Pelews, was duly reached on October 6th. A reconnaissance by destroyers having drawn fire from a battery of 6-in guns which commanded the approach, planes from the airplane carrier Harvard flew in and plentifully distributed phosphorus gas and explosive bombs over the position, whose defenders were quickly put out of action. The actual landing took place without the loss of a single life, and at 9 p.m. on October 6th, 8,000 troops were ashore. Without an hour's delay, the control force, which experience in previous landings at Truk, Jaluit, and Ponape had made highly efficient, began its work of unshipping guns, stores, and equipment. In less than a week, Angkor had been rendered safe against a surprise attack by the mounting of 7-inch and lighter guns and the establishment of an aerodrome. The defenses proved their efficacy on the 12th, when 2 Japanese planes from Yap, coming to spy out the land, were pursued and shot down in flames. When news of this successful descent upon the Pelu Islands reached Japan, it created universal dismay, and in many quarters absolute despair. The War Council had to confess itself outwitted at all points, nor did the polite reminder of the naval men that they had foreseen this precise development and vainly urged the taking of measures to defeat it, allay the mortification of the military chiefs. That the position had now become extremely serious, not to say desperate, was clear to all. By a succession of bold yet well-considered moves, the Americans had contrived to modify the whole strategical outlook to their advantage. At the beginning of the war, they had been confined exclusively to the eastern sector of the Pacific, apparently with no prospect of breaking the fetters imposed upon them by geographical circumstance. In a fruitless effort to burst through the invisible but rigid cordon they had, in defiance of the elementary laws of strategy, launched their foolhardy enterprise against the Bonins, only to meet with the disaster their folly had invited. But the lesson learned at such bitter cost had not been in vain. From the defeat of the Bonins expedition dated the inception of that new and sounder strategy, the fruits of which were now being garnered. With the seizure of the Pelu group, the end of the war had been brought within sight, for it could not be long ere Japan was compelled to play her last card as the alternative to owning defeat. At first sight, the American position was still far from satisfactory, and might even have been termed precarious. For while the new post at Angkor was now too strongly defended to be capable of reduction by anything less than a powerful force, it was dangerously remote from any large American base, Hawaii being 8,800 and Tutuila 3,600 miles distant. Moreover, the line of approach to Angkor both from Hawaii and Tutuila was outflanked by the Japanese fortress of Guam, and still more so by the island of Yap, which lay only 300 miles to the northeast. 500 miles to the west was the coast of the Philippines, in the harbors of which the Japanese might secretly assemble an overwhelming force for the reconquest of the Pelus. To many onlookers it must have seemed as if the United States, in venturing so far towards the west, had thrust its head into the lion's jaws. But a closer survey tended to modify this view. Before establishing themselves at the Pelus, the Americans had methodically secured control of all potential enemy bases lying athwart the main route to the islands, and by promptly making use of these bases for their own ships, had been able to institute a fairly efficient patrol along the whole line of communication. Though errant Japanese cruisers or submarines might cause trouble, or even serious loss, by striking at the convoys which were now continually passing to and fro along the route in question, such raids could exert no decisive influence on the fortunes of the campaign. Somewhere behind the line of patrols lay the United States battle fleet, no longer tethered to its eastern bases, but henceforth able to strike with full weight at any point between Hawaii and the Philippines, thanks to the floating fuel reserves now available at Jaluit, Ponape, Truk, and Angkor. Japan could not hope to recover her lost islands, and so arrest this insidious advance into her own waters until she had defeated the hostile fleet. Nothing less would suffice to retrieve the situation. To ignore the challenge and keep her battleships inactive would leave the Americans free to extend their hold on the western sector of the Pacific by seizing the Mariana Islands, an operation which had now become feasible. Notwithstanding their lack of definite intelligence, the Japanese well knew the military power of the United States to have grown enormously in the past 18 months. It was not improbable that, within this period, the Navy had doubled its strength in every type of vessel except battleships, nor was it impossible that the battle fleet had been reinforced. By virtue of her infinitely superior wealth and industrial resources, the United States could by this time have equipped herself with all the materials essential for waging aggressive warfare overseas, while her army might now run into millions. New tonnage, it was known, was pouring out of her shipyards, and this shipping furnished her with all the transports and auxiliaries needed for an amphibious expedition of the first magnitude. While the cost of the war to date had been immense, it had not seriously depleted her coffers. She had an inexhaustible supply of foodstuffs and raw materials of every description. Her people, despite an ingrained aversion to war, were displaying by 100 signs their inflexible determination to continue the struggle until a lasting and honorable peace had been won. Now that the tide of war was running so strongly in their favor, they were less inclined than ever to accept a patched-up truce. All this was known to the rulers of Japan, who were at the same time painfully conscious of their own less enviable position. The war had been in progress a year and a half. How much longer could Japan afford to continue a struggle which had already taxed her strength to the utmost? She might, at a liberal estimate, carry on for a further 6 months, always provided her home front stood firm. But the popular temper was not such as to inspire the government with confidence on this point. Were it possible to achieve some undeniable success, decisive enough to impress American public opinion with the futility of going on with the war, all might yet be well. Japan had previously caused it to be known, through neutral intermediaries, that she was willing to entertain reasonable terms of peace. She was prepared to waive an indemnity on condition that the insular territories she had wrested from the United States were confirmed to her. These feelers, however, had produced no encouraging reaction in America, and in the meantime the loss of the Pelews had divested such proposals of whatever claim to attention they might otherwise have possessed. But if the gravity of the outlook was realized in Tokyo, there was as yet no disposition to sue for peace on the enemy's terms. The War Council still pinned its faith to the fleet, which was intact both as to material and morale. With this weapon, a blow might be struck at the enemy's heart. How to employ it under the most promising conditions now became the Council's prime concern. Since the American line of approach lay far to the southward, the Bonins were no longer suitable as a main war base for the fleet. Guam would have been ideal for the purpose so far as position went, but it had neither the anchorage room nor shore facilities requisite for a great naval force. Cavite, in Manila Bay, was accordingly selected as the main base, in spite of the considerable distance which separated it from Angkor. The resources of the arsenal at Cavite had been greatly extended under the Japanese occupation, and reliance was placed upon patrols operating from the eastern shores of Mindanao to send warning of any important American movements in time for the main fleet to intervene if Guam, or, as seemed not unlikely, Mindanao itself, were threatened. On October 15th, therefore, the whole fleet arrived at Manila, having come by way of the Balintang Channel to evade observation. But its passage did not go unremarked, for 2 U.S. submarines, V-7 and V-11, which were cruising to eastward of the channel, had sighted the vast procession of ships and duly flashed word to the proper quarter. Since the climax of the naval war was fast approaching, and a clash between the two fleets had become only a question of weeks, it is desirable at this juncture to examine the composition of the rival forces. The effect of the Washington Treaty, signed in February 1922, had been virtually to stabilize the American and Japanese battle fleets from that date to the outbreak of war, 9 years later. At the beginning of hostilities, each country had decided to augment its fleet by new construction, but the gigantic battle cruisers which Japan was rumored to have laid down had, in fact, never got beyond the stage of paper design. Foreseeing that these vessels could not, in the most favorable event, be ready for service in less than 2 years, the Japanese had wisely resolved not to dissipate their energies in building ships which were unlikely to play any part in the war, and which might even be rendered obsolete before completion. Other means of reinforcing the exiguous battle fleet lay readier to hand. In the Kaga and the Akagi they had 2 vessels which, originally designed as capital ships, had afterwards been converted into airplane carriers to save them from destruction under the ruling of the Washington Treaty. Of these, the 23-knot Kaga had never been a complete success, the special functions of an airplane carrier requiring her to be swifter by at least 7 knots than the battleships with which she cooperates. The Akagi had given more satisfaction, thanks to her speed of 28 knots. But the completion in recent years of the Hosho and other fast carriers had provided the Japanese Navy with an ample contingent of such vessels. Consequently, as soon as war appeared imminent, the naval authorities decided to restore the Kaga and the Akagi to their original designs, since in this way the battle fleet would gain 2 units of matchless power. The work was put in hand immediately, and to ensure prompt completion, most of the guns and armor plates needed to equip the 2 ships were ordered in Europe. By June 1932, both the reconditioned ships were ready for sea. The Kaga was now a battleship of 40,000 tons and 23-knot speed, mounting 10 16-inch guns, her vital parts encased in stout mail. The Akagi emerged as a battle cruiser of 44,000 tons, with a main battery of 8 16-inch guns and capable of steaming at 30 knots. Each in its way was a more powerful ship than any unit of the United States Navy. Their completion brought the Japanese strength up to 12 capital ships. 5 were battle cruisers, with a squadron speed of 28 knots. The other 7 were battleships, averaging 22 knots. Of heavy guns, this fleet mounted 114 in all, 34 being of 16-inch and the remainder of 14-inch caliber. There were also in service 4 airplane carriers, 23 cruisers, including a number of large vessels armed with 8-inch guns, approximately 100 destroyers, and 94 submarines of varying tonnage and power. Against this fleet, the United States could marshal in the Western Pacific 16 battleships, 23 cruisers, 115 destroyers, and 80 submarines, with 5 airplane carriers. The battleships mounted in the aggregate 170 big guns, Videlicet 22 of 12-inch, 24 of 14-inch, and 24 of 16-inch caliber. In speed, they were inferior to the Japanese, none having a legend velocity above 21 knots, while the older ships, in spite of new boilers, were not good for more than 20 knots. On the other hand, 5 of the Japanese battleships could steam at 23 knots, and 2 at 22 knots. To the 5 Japanese battle cruisers, the Americans could oppose no ships of equivalent speed and armament. If, therefore, the Japanese battle fleet was outnumbered numerically and in gun power, its higher mobility conferred upon it a tactical advantage of the greatest importance. In all other types, the 2 navies were fairly well matched. Since the Japanese destroyers as a class were larger, swifter, and more heavily armed than the American boats, these attributes went far to balance the disparity in numbers. The United States battle fleet, it will be noticed, had not been increased by new construction. 4 battle cruisers of 52,000 tons each had been designed early in the war, but, for the same reasons which had restrained the Japanese from proceeding with their new capital ships, these American vessels were built at a very slow rate, and at this time were not even launched. The main constructional effort had been devoted to smaller craft, the demand for which was insatiable. Of these, a considerable number was now in service. At one stage of the war, the rearmament of several battleships with guns of a larger caliber than those already on board had been seriously contemplated, on the strength of reports which declared the Japanese to have equipped several of their battleships, Fuso, Yamashiro, Ise, and Hyuga, with 8 16-inch guns apiece, in place of the 12 14-inch weapons originally carried. While these reports were accepted as authentic by many naval officers who seemed to have overlooked the technical objections involved, they were scouted by Admirals Muller and Harper, to whose firm opposition it was due that the dangerous experiment of rearming 6 American battleships with heavier guns than they were designed to carry was never attempted. In regard to personnel, that imponderable factor which nevertheless counts for much more than material, there seemed little to choose between the rival fleets. During the preceding 18 months, the American crews had been trained to a high standard of proficiency. The percentage of green men was now negligible. If the American system of discipline was less draconic than the Japanese, it appeared to give excellent results. As for the officers, the most striking difference was that the average age of American senior line executives was considerably above that of corresponding Japanese ranks. Some of the American captains were elderly men. Not a few of the Japanese captains were still in their 30s. Several of the Japanese flag officers were barely over 40. Although the impending battle was to be fought at a period when Japan had sustained a series of reverses, there was nothing indicative of a decline in the morale of her sailors. All the evidence points the other way. Practically every Japanese commentator insists that the Navy as a whole was thirsting for battle and supremely confident of victory. But the conduct of the Japanese fleet during the action itself renders this assurance superfluous. As most American critics generously admit, had the enemy possessed an additional squadron of battleships, the outcome of the duel might have been other than what it was. The Japanese did all that brave and skillful seamen could have done, proving themselves worthy successors of the men who had built up Nippon's sea power at the Yalu and Tsushima. From every angle of view, the great naval action off Yap was an historic event to which both combatants may look back with sentiments of patriotic pride.
This concludes today's reading of The Great Pacific War by Hector Bywater, presented by Major Intonio. Join us also tomorrow for the next chapter, or download the complete audiobook from our webshop at www.payhip.com/Antonio. Thank you for listening, and so long.